In the heart of the glorious Roman Empire, where the cobblestone streets stretched endlessly, the arenas towered in the Mediterranean sun and wind, there was a silent darkness that covered daily life, the darkness of the slave markets. There, people were no longer human. They became commodities, with price tags hanging around their necks like cattle that could breathe, tremble, and dream of freedom. Try stopping one morning at the Forum Romanum, the largest slave market in the Roman capital. In the middle of the bustling square, where the cries of sails mixed with the sound of horses' hooves and the pungent smell of bound flesh, people built high wooden platforms. On them, trembling bodies stood crowded together, chains dangling. Each person wore a small board hanging on his chest, called a titulus. On it was not a glorious biography, not a proud genealogy, but cold lines. Age, origin, illness, temperament. Some were marked hot-tempered, biting. Others, read and write, can be a secretary. Both strengths and weaknesses were laid out before the eyes like a defective item, ready for the buyer to examine. Slave traders walked back and forth, their eyes scrutinizing them like those of a good horse. They pressed on the biceps, adjusted the teeth, even kicked the calves to see if the muscles were still strong. If the hair was gray, the slave would be dyed black. If the face was gaunt, they would oil the skin to make it shine like a polished item before being put up for sale. At times, the crowd erupted into bidding. People shouted out numbers, raised their hands, their eyes burning with greed. A Greek girl with sparkling eyes, more than a fertile field. A strong young man could buy 2 years of Roman soldiers' wages. People with talent who can play music or heal are fought over like treasures.
Welcome to my channel. Today we will take you back in time to explore the hidden truths of the Roman Empire and bring you the untold story of the people who made the empire what it was. Now let's dive deep into the story. In the heart of the glorious Roman Empire, where the cobblestone roads stretched on endlessly and the arenas stood tall amidst the Mediterranean sun and wind, there was a silent darkness that covered daily life, the darkness of the slave markets. There, people are no longer human. They become commodities, with price tags hanging around their necks like cattle that can breathe, tremble, and dream of freedom. Stop one morning at the Forum Romanum, Rome's largest slave market, in the middle of the bustling square, where the cries of hawkers mingle with the clatter of horses and the pungent smell of bound flesh. High wooden platforms are erected. On them, trembling bodies stand, their chains dangling. Each man wore a small plaque hanging on his chest, called it. It contained no glorious resume, no proud pedigree, but cold words: age, country of origin, illnesses, temperament. Some were marked hot-tempered, biting. Others, able to read and write, can be a secretary. Strengths and weaknesses were laid out before one's eyes like a defective commodity ready for the buyer to examine. Slave traders walked back and forth, their eyes as critical as those of a selector of a fine horse. They pressed on the biceps, squeezed the teeth, even kicked the calves to see if the muscles were still firm. If the hair was gray, the slave was dyed black. If the face was gaunt, the skin was oiled to make it shine like a polished item for sale. At times, the crowd erupted into bidding. Numbers were shouted, hands raised, eyes blazing with greed. A Greek girl with sparkling eyes, more than a fertile field. A strong young man could be bought with 2 years' wages as a Roman soldier. A talented artist, a musician, or a healer was even more sought after as a treasure. But what lies behind those numbers? A child taken from his mother in a war, a Gaul peasant captured when his homeland fell. People who once had a home, who once knew freedom, now lost in a strange land, trembling as their identities are put up for sale. The slave market was more than a place of economic exchange. It was also a mirror reflecting the cold gaze of a civilization. The Roman Empire, hailed as the pinnacle of law and architecture, was built on the trade of human beings. Behind the marble columns, behind the orations of philosophers, there was the sound of dragging chains and the look of despair. The Romans viewed slaves as a necessary part of life, walking property, just like a vase, a horse, a piece of land, except that this commodity could cry, feel pain, and dream of one day being freed from its chains. What was even more frightening was the normalization. Roman children grew up passing through slave markets, seeing them as a natural part of the world. They learned to bargain for a human being, like they learned to choose a good grape or a jar of wine. When cruelty became routine, the whole society ceased to feel cruel. In a small corner of the market, perhaps a philosopher stood watching, sighing, "What is a man, if measured only by money?" But then, he turned and walked away, because his very dinner tonight would be served by those trembling hands. The slave market ended as the sun set. Some were bought, others were left behind, waiting for someone to bid tomorrow. The clanging of chains echoed in the twilight, a reminder that in the glory of Rome, there was always the shadow of the forgotten. That is the price of a civilization, a price paid not in silver and gold, but in freedom, in the blood and tears of countless human lives. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of our series exploring the hidden truths of the Roman Empire. If you want to learn more about the fascinating stories of the people who lived in the shadow of the Roman Empire, stay tuned for more updates. And don't forget to subscribe to be the first to know when new episodes are released. See you next time, in the depths of ancient Rome's immense wealth, where gold flowed like water and marble palaces reached for the heavens. There existed a darkness so profound that it made one question the very essence of humanity. This is a story about the lowest, the most despicable, the common worker. If the Roman slave market was an ocean, then at its deepest level were the most despicable of human beings. The common slave laborers. They had no special talents, no pretty faces to decorate, and no knowledge to become teachers or doctors. They had only calloused hands, thin shoulders, and exhausted strength like torches that would sooner or later burn out. The price of such a person, according to records, was only 1,500 to 2,000 sesterces. It sounds like a lot, but in fact it was only equal to 2 years of salary for a common Roman soldier. In other words, a soldier had to go into battle, endure hunger, thirst, and swords for 2 years to exchange for the status of a common slave. In other words, a person's fate was neatly reduced to a calculation of income and expenditure in the books of the rich. These slaves were often bought to do the hardest work, plowing vast fields, hauling stones for great construction projects, or being thrown into dark mines. In those mines, with no light, the air was damp and poisonous. Their lives were like candles blown out after only a few seasons. The Romans had a fateful saying, "He who goes down to the mines, goes down to the grave." The luckier ones, if you could call them lucky, were sent to bakeries, blacksmiths, or wealthy homes to do menial work. They lived quietly by the fires, accustomed to the shouts of their masters, accustomed to the smell of dust and ashes. Each day passed like an endless cycle, waking up at dawn, bending over to work until the moon hung high in the sky, then falling asleep on the cold floor. These people are like invisible people. In a glamorous society, they are present everywhere. In the harvested grain, in every stone of the arena, in the straight paved road leading to Rome. But their names are not recorded. Only their sweat and blood seep into the soil and rocks. If a common slave got sick, broke a bone, or missed work, he was worthless. His master could sell him as cheaply as a broken vase, or throw him away without mercy. In that cold gaze, people were just tools. When the tools broke, they were replaced without a word of regret. However, despite being considered walking objects, those slaves still carried within them a quiet vitality. Perhaps, on rare moonlit nights, when the fields were covered in mist, they quietly raised their heads to look at the sky, whispering memories of a roof, a piece of land far away that had been stolen from them. In their hearts, there was still a faint flame, the desire for freedom, the hope of being able to escape from the shackles. Even though that hope was as fragile as a grain of sand in the desert, often what haunts us is not the brutality that is evident, but the silence of history. We know the names of emperors, generals, philosophers, but the men who picked up hoes to build roads, who fell in mines, who sweated in the fields, they are only shadows, dissolved into dust. There is a bitter paradox. It was these cheap slaves who were the building blocks of the empire. Without them, the roads could not be extended, the arenas could not stand, the fields could not yield. They were the silent foundation on which the glorious Rome stood. However, in the eyes of society, they are still just common goods, easy to buy, easy to replace. A status worth only a few jars of good wine or a lavish party of the nobility. Looking back, we can see the truth. The cheapest price in the slave market is the most expensive price that history has to pay, because it is the cruelty to the lowly that sows the seeds of injustice, nurtures the undercurrents, and eventually becomes the flames of rebellion that burn down an entire empire. In the whispers of the past, we can still hear the heavy footsteps, the sound of shovels pounding on rocks, the sighs in the dark. These are not distant echoes, but the heartbeats of buried souls, reminding us that all glory has a price, and that price is often paid in the blood of nameless men. And so, as we marvel at the grandeur of ancient Rome, let us not forget the silent sacrifice of these forgotten souls, for it is in their struggle and suffering that we find the true cost of empire. Thank you for watching. Friends, welcome to this channel. Today we are going to continue part 3, Slave Hire, the ancient version of outsourcing services, while the rich could afford to buy a human being outright and make him their private property. The middle-class citizens with some wealth but not yet able to reach luxury had a different path. They went to the market, not to own, but to rent slaves by the day. Imagine a morning in the square. Amid the clamor and the dust, there are small wooden boards hanging in the corners of the market, where people write down the list of slaves available for hire. Does someone need a pair of strong arms to carry rocks? Yes. Does someone want a woman to clean and cook for the anniversary of a death? Yes. Some people even hire slaves just to stand guard at the door or to look majestic at the evening party. One identity, one full day, in exchange for a few coins. That is the price of an ancient, cold, and cheap outsourcing service. In Roman society, this seemed so normal. Just as we rent a car, a boat, a tool, they rented a human being. A living being who could breathe, who could dream, but who had no right to decide his own fate. The hirer only needs to pay a sum of money, but the slaves have to pay with their own strength, blood and tears. That day, they are tools in the hands of strangers, working without rest. Then when night falls, they are sent back, waiting for tomorrow to continue the cycle of suffering. We might think that renting a slave is less harsh than owning a slave, but in truth it contains a different pain, the pain of uncertainty. A person who is bought out at least knows who his master is, what roof he will live under, what work he will do. But a person who is rented out belongs to one person this morning, and to another tomorrow night. They wander between strange hands, without roots, without a place. They are like dry leaves blown by the wind, each day in a different direction, not knowing where they will fall. Behind the practice of slave leasing was a chillingly casual mentality. The Romans had normalized the buying and selling of human beings to the point of considering it a convenience service. Just as we can now use an app to hail a cab, the Romans could simply go to the market and rent a pair of arms, a pair of legs, or a figure. Such convenience, if viewed with an unfeeling eye, can be praised as a manifestation of economic flexibility. But viewed with the heart, it is only a convenience of cruelty, where people turn their fellow human beings into mobile tools, as if they had no soul. Perhaps during the days of being hired out, there were slave eyes silently looking up to the sky, wondering, who am I? Who do I belong to? Will there ever be a day when I can belong to myself? But the answer, like the wind blowing in the Roman square, was only silence. Historically, such forms have instilled in society a habit of considering human labor as a commodity, as a service. And that habit, once ingrained, will become a genetic wound in civilization. Today, when we look back, we see not only cruelty, but also a reflection of the present. Because, somewhere, there are still people hired with cheap labor, exploited without the right to speak up. Roman times and modern times, although thousands of years apart, sometimes only inform the nature of injustice is still there. The Roman version of outsourcing teaches us a bitter lesson, that convenience for the strong often means pain for the weak. And in the cold eyes of the market, humanity is often the first thing to be traded away. As the evening sun sets over the square, the slaves hired for the day are led back, like cattle being herded into a pen, awaiting the next day. They are no longer named individuals, but floating labor units, to be paid for, bartered, and then forgotten. Perhaps the sound of iron chains ringing in the dark night, mixed with the wind blowing across Palatine Hill, still echoes today as a reminder that every time humans turn their fellow human beings into services, into tools, cruelty is implicitly legalized, and in that darkness, the human soul is wounded, silently bleeding through the centuries. Friends, please give this video a thumbs up for more videos about ancient Rome. See you next time. The most expensive slaves in ancient Rome were not women or children or prisoners of war. These were slaves whose specialty was making money for their owners. We are talking about doctors, accountants, managers, lawyers, and teachers. In ancient Rome, skilled slaves, especially those who could speak Greek, were very much in demand. As a result, they were also the most expensive. In fact, some of them cost as much as 100,000 sesterces, which is equivalent to a huge house with a big garden or several farms. But why did the Romans deify skills like this? Let us tell you. Part 4. Skilled slaves, treasures in the eyes of the elite. In the bustling Roman marketplace, not all identities were sold at a pittance. There were those who, thanks to a skillful hand, a profound mind, or a rare talent, became treasures in the eyes of the upper class. They were still slaves, but they were luxury goods, sought after and valued like a bright gem imprisoned in an iron cage. The Romans called them servi artificiosi, skilled slaves, while a captured peasant was worth only a few years of military pay. A Greek physician, secretary, artist or philosopher could be sold for 10,000, 50,000, or even 100,000 sesterces. That was the equivalent of a mansion with a lush vineyard or a farm full of common slaves. For the aristocracy, these slaves were more than mere workers. They were status symbols, something to be flaunted at evening parties. When a senator brought a guest into his home, nothing made him prouder than to announce, "This is my personal physician, who studied in Alexandria," or "This is my tutor in Greek, who can read and recite Homer." In a society where reputation was more important than truth, a talented slave became a spiritual ornament for his master. A piece of music played at a banquet, a poem recited amid the scent of wine, was not only pleasing to the ear, it also demonstrated the owner's elegance and education. Yet paradoxically, it is precisely when their talents shine that their chains become heavier. A doctor can save his master's life, but not his own freedom. A philosopher can preach justice, but he himself is sold as a commodity. The tragedy is that the lyre plays its melody, while its strings are tied to its frame. The Greeks, after their country's defeat, often became intellectual slaves to Rome. They took their knowledge, their literature, their art, and were turned into tools for the vanquished. A Roman master could have a Greek tutor teach his son the philosophy of freedom, while the tutor himself had no freedom. Many female slaves who were talented in singing, dancing, and playing musical instruments were also considered living gems in the hands of wealthy families. They lit up parties with their voices and graceful dances, but faded into darkness when the party ended. If favored by their masters, they could live a life less miserable than slaves who worked the fields. But that favor was only a gilded cage, where birds were still imprisoned, no matter how beautiful their wings were. The most heartbreaking thing about this system was that a slave could be bought and sold based on his skill alone. He had no say in the matter. A father could sell his son not because he was a bad person, but because he was good at numbers and could make a lot of money for the new owner. This was not uncommon in ancient Rome. There are those who are recorded as investment assets. A healthy, intelligent boy is taught to read and write by his master, and each knowledge he accumulates, each skill he masters, increases his value, like a piece of land being fertilized. People buy slaves not out of compassion, but because they see profit. Just like planting seeds not to enjoy the flowers but to sell the fruit. In that picture, what makes us heartbroken is not only the exploitation, but also the substitution of human values. Talent is a sacred gift of fate, what makes a person shine. But in the eyes of the Romans, it was only a factor that increased the price of an item. A person, whether wise or ordinary, still could not escape the fate of being sold. If we stop at a market, we will surely see a Greek man, gray hair, sad eyes, standing silently on the platform. People pay him a price, not because they respect his age, but because he knows how to read and teach. Each cry is a knife stabbing into self-esteem, and each glance judging him is a reminder that talent sometimes becomes the heaviest chain. Perhaps in the middle of the Roman night, in candlelit rooms, there are sounds of zithers and poems. But if we listen closely, beneath that music is a sigh swallowed into the darkness. It is the voice of those with talent like stars, but forced to shine for others while they themselves are forever locked in the darkness. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss any of our videos. See you next time. Welcome to the series, When Destiny Turns. Today we unveil part 5, Beauty Becomes a Commodity, When Appearance Determines Destiny. In the bustling Roman slave markets, amidst the clamor and desperation of countless lives hanging in the balance, there emerged a unique and spine-chilling kind of value appearance. No need for outstanding talent, no need for profound knowledge, just a bright face, a well-proportioned body, smiling eyes, rosy lips. Those were enough to turn a person into an expensive commodity. The Romans, who loved beauty and revered the body, turned beauty itself into a form of currency. A beautiful slave could be sold for 30,000 or even 100 meals, the equivalent of a large olive grove. There were wealthy men who did not need more workers or more fields, but still spent money to own a beautiful slave simply because it was a way to show off wealth and power. During lavish parties, when wine flowed like a stream and torches were lit, a beautiful slave carrying wine, offering fruit, or just standing still beside her master was enough to make the guests admire. It was the luxury car of ancient times, a way to show off without words. The Romans drank wine not only with their mouths, but also with their eyes of pride. Look what I have, who is serving me? But beneath the glamour lies a great tragedy. The more beautiful a slave is, the tighter she is chained. She becomes a living decoration, pampered with cosmetics, perfumes, and gorgeous clothes. But no one asks her if she wants to live that life. The outward splendor only hides an inner heart filled with fear and loneliness. Girls from Egypt, Syria, Gaul, or Thrace were often sought after for their exotic beauty that captivated the Romans. But it was precisely this difference that led to their imprisonment. They were turned into breathing wooden statues, displayed in villas to satisfy the curious eyes of the nobility. There are young men with strong bodies and handsome faces who cannot escape the same fate. They are chosen to be close servants, closely involved in sensitive tasks, where their bodies no longer belong to them, but become tools for the will of others. The Romans also had a habit of beautifying themselves to increase their value. Slaves were bathed in perfumes, their skin was polished with bright powder, and they were dressed neatly. They became staged perfect versions of themselves, not unlike a polished statue, so that when they stepped onto the sales platform, the eyes of customers were immediately drawn to them. These were fake portraits, where suffering was hidden under layers of makeup. The sad thing is, while a free person can be proud of his appearance, for a slave, beauty becomes an invisible chain. The more beautiful a girl is, the harder it is to escape her fate, because the buyer will never let go of his treasure, and that beauty, instead of bringing happiness, only sows more suffering, like a brilliant flower plucked and placed in a golden vase, never to bask in the sunlight again. History has left us chilling records. Many beautiful slaves were sold with ambiguous hints that they were more than just domestic work. Beauty became an excuse to legitimize the appropriation, to turn the human body into a commodity to satisfy desire. When we look at that, we suddenly understand. A civilization can praise beauty, but it can also bend it to serve power and greed. Rome honored art, sculpture, poetry, but at the same time, it also turned beautiful people into objects to be shown off and enjoyed. If one day, we stand in an ancient Roman villa, looking at the mosaics depicting feasts, we may see the silhouettes of beautiful slaves standing in attendance. They have no names, no voices. But the eyes in the paintings, even though painted 1,000 years ago, can still make us shudder. Because we know those are the eyes of people for whom beauty has become a life sentence. And then we realize, throughout history, beauty has never been just a gift, it can be a knife. For Roman slaves, beauty was a shiny chain, binding them for life. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through time and reflection on this powerful episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and share if this video resonates with you. Your engagement fuels our passion. Stay tuned for new episodes. Until next time, farewell. What kind of life did the slaves in ancient Rome live? We all know about the hard work in the fields, the copper mines, and the gladiators in the Colosseum. What about the entertainers? What did it mean to be a musician or actor in ancient Rome? Let's find out in this episode of our series about the life of slaves in ancient Rome. Part 6, the world of entertainment slaves, musicians, singers, and actors. If the common labor slaves were the silent shoulders that shouldered the fields and constructions, then the artist slaves were the fire that decorated the lavish banquets of the Roman aristocracy. They were the sound of the zither in the night, the voice that blended with the wine, the dance that made people forget the blood and tears out there. But while the bright lights shone on the stage, darkness covered their lives. In the opulent villas, as the dawn fades behind the marble columns, the convivium, the banquet begins. The tables are laden with wine, fruit, and roasted meat, and amid the smoke of incense, the slave artists come out. Some play the lyre, some play the flute, some dance with silk, some recite Homeric verses. Each act is a spice that adds splendor to the feast. The wealthy Romans saw the possession of artistic slaves as a mark of luxury. A householder with a sweet-voiced singer, a skilled musician, or a graceful dancer was considered refined and of good taste. As a result, these slaves were sometimes more valuable than skilled craftsmen, because they not only worked, but also satisfied the spiritual pleasures of their masters. But behind the applause and the bravos of the guests, there is silent pain. A girl who sings at a party, even though her voice is as sweet as a nightingale, knows that when the party is over, she is just a slave to be ordered around, sold, or forgotten like an abandoned harp. A young man who dances an ancient Greek dance, even though the crowd admires him, has no right to choose who will be his next master. Many slave girls were trained from childhood to sing, play instruments, and dance. They were like flowers plucked when they were still young, then shaped to the will of their buyers. Their eyes knew how to cry silently, their feet knew how to tire, but they were not allowed to stop. To the nobility, talent was just a tool that shone brighter the more valuable it was. There were also slaves who became stars in the slave world. A talented dancer could be sought after everywhere. A singer with a honeyed voice could become the pride of the whole clan. But their fame did not bring them freedom, but only made them more valuable commodities, making it harder to escape from the cage. The most heartbreaking thing is that the line between art and abuse is often blurred. At wild parties, slave artists can be forced to perform shameful acts, to make fun of their masters and guests. The music is no longer music, but sobbing. The dance is no longer art, but simply a display of the body in the eyes of desire. If we close our eyes and imagine, we might see a Roman night party, wine glasses raised high, laughter echoing, melodies ringing under the light of oil lamps. But behind that is a trembling heart, a soul being eroded. But few people remember that, in the glittering parties, there were anonymous people who contributed their voices and dances to create a backdrop for the splendor of the powerful. They left behind not names, but a faint echo, like the sound of a zither in the wind and then fading away. Today, when we think of Roman slaves, we often think of sweat in the fields, blood in the arena. That too was part of the tragedy of those who were turned into objects of entertainment, whose light was drained to brighten another's brief night. And we realize perhaps their greatest pain is not the iron chains, but the invisible chains of oblivion. When the lights go out, when the party is over, they are left with only silence, But in the flow of history, their music and singing still echo like a whisper reminding that every civilization has a stage behind, where the halo is built on anonymous tears. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. In the vast and intricate world of ancient Rome, where power, wealth, and corruption intertwined, like ivy around a marble column, there existed a peculiar commodity, one whose value was measured not in gold or silver but in blood and bone. Meet the gladiator, a living, breathing piece of property, an investment in human suffering. Now, you might ask, why do we need this when Rome already had slaves? Ah, my friend, that's the rub. Slaves were numerous, but the gladiator was an altogether different kettle of fish. You see, a gladiator was not merely a chattel, a thing to be bought and sold, but a specialized instrument of carnage, a finely tuned machine designed to do only two things: survive and kill. To understand the true worth of a gladiator, one must delve into the heart of Rome's obsession with spectacle, into the very core of their culture where the roar of the crowd and the thirst for blood were considered the nectar of the gods. The gladiators were the stars of this macabre theater, and their value was directly proportional to their ability to entertain, to make the crowd roar with excitement. Now, the price of a gladiator varied wildly, depending on his size, talent, and reputation. Some were sold for as little as a few thousand sesterces, while others, they fetched prices like a fine vintage wine, as much as 100,000 sesterces or more. That, my dear viewer, is the equivalent of a magnificent mansion in modern Rome. But remember, this wasn't a dwelling place that was being purchased, but a ticket to a premature death. Oh yes, the more famous a gladiator, the more valuable he was, but at the same time, the closer he was to the sword of fate. You see, the crowd demanded blood, and blood they got. It didn't matter if the gladiator won or lost. His life was not his own. For the most part, these men were nothing more than pawns in a deadly game, disposable commodities whose lives were measured in the fickle whims of the audience. Now, where did these gladiators come from? They came from all walks of life. Some were prisoners of war, captured after their armies collapsed, such as the Gauls, the Germans, the Dacians, the Scythians, and the Egyptians. Some were born slaves, doomed to a life of toil and misery. Others were free citizens, so poor that they sold themselves for a chance to escape their miserable existence. But for the majority, they were nothing more than chain-killing machines, mere instruments of violence honed to perfection in special schools of arms, known as ludus gladiator. Here, day after day, they trained relentlessly to become the last man standing. To the owners of the gladiators, these fighters were investments, assets that could either turn a profit or be a complete loss. A skilled swordsman, strong and handsome, could bring fame and fortune to his owner. Each time they fought, their owners would rent them out for public games, reaping large sums of money. The crowd roared with excitement as these men fought to the death, oblivious to the fact that every swing, every thrust was a testament to the dehumanizing spectacle of the times. As the clash of steel echoed through the Colosseum and the cries of the fallen mingled with the jeers of the crowd, it's important to remember that for every cheer, there was a tear shed in secret. For every victory, there were countless defeats. And for every life that ended in a blaze of glory, there were many more that were extinguished in the shadows. The truth was that these gladiators were not just warriors, they were not just slaves. They were human beings. Behind the armor, behind the mask, beat a heart that knew fear, that loved life and that yearned for freedom. They were men who fought not only for their own survival, but for the right to be seen, to be heard, to be more than just a commodity, more than just a gladiator. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit yearns for light. Even when faced with death, the will to live, the desire to be free, that's something worth fighting for. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a call to action for us to fight for freedom, for empathy, and for the right to tell their story so that their sacrifice was not in vain. So let the echoes of their courage ring through the ages, and let their story be a beacon of hope in our darkest hours. Thank you for watching. Emperor Nero was infamous for his cruelty. However, even he drew the line at torturing and murdering children, wasn't he? Wrong? Nero established a special gladiatorial school for children. His goal was to create little beasts ready to fight each other to the death. It was called the ludus matinus. Can you imagine the screams of children as they fought with swords and shields? Historian Suetonius described them as diabolical instruments of cruelty. He said Emperor Nero liked to watch these fights. Why? So that later he could enjoy a good laugh as he watched the children die. This evil emperor was the worst nightmare for any parent. But even he couldn't compare with the ordinary citizens of ancient Rome. In today's episode, we will look at what exactly went on in the Roman slave markets, and I will tell you about the most tragic lot, the child slaves. Part 8. Child slaves. Cheap but full of tragedy. Of all the slaves for sale in Rome, there was one image that was the most heart-wrenching. The children. Amidst the noisy crowds of the slave market, among the large bodies in chains, there were glimpses of young eyes, looking at life with bewilderment. These were creatures who had not yet understood the world and were priced like cheap goods. A child slave typically cost between 500 and 2,000 sesterces, much cheaper than an adult laborer. The Romans saw children as long-term investments. small, weak, and incapable of doing heavy work, but able to be nurtured and trained to become the perfect slave. Just as one might buy a young animal to gradually train, children were also brought into the same cruel cycle. Some were prisoners of war. When the Roman legions stormed the city, their parents were killed or taken away, and the children were rounded up and led to the market like frightened lambs. Some were the children of slaves born in their master's house, internal products called verni. They did not know what freedom was, and from the moment of birth they belonged to someone else. Because of their small size, children were often given odd jobs, running errands, fanning their masters, serving the children of the rich, or being turned into living toys for the children of the nobility. Imagine a boy or girl was bought only to be the entertainment of a 7-year-old boy named Lucius. They were dressed in strange clothes, given new names, and then forgotten when a new toy appeared. A childhood was stolen, turned into tragedy right in the innocent laughter of others. But the tragedy does not end there. There were children who were not bought to be raised, but to serve dark purposes. In the dark corners of Rome, there were wealthy people who were willing to pay to own children for pleasure. History does not need too many words to describe this. Suffice it to say, there were young souls who were turned into objects of lust, and then grew up with wounds that never healed. Even when raised to work, the childhood of a slave is nothing more than a series of days of discipline under the whip. Children are taught absolute obedience, trained from a young age to serve. A lucky few are able to learn to read and write, but not to become free people, but to increase their value in the eyes of others. Each skill learned, each lesson remembered, is not a key to freedom, but a new chain that tightens the chain around their status. One sometimes wonders, what did slave children dream of during the long Roman night? Perhaps they dreamed of the arms of their lost parents, or of a home where the whip would not sound. But the next morning those dreams were shattered when they were sent to work, when their little feet had to run around the villa, when their young hands had to carry out the work of adults. During slave uprisings, children were also captured. They did not hold weapons, but their eyes carried a deep sadness, as if to speak for thousands of other little souls. We never had a childhood, we only knew chains. The sad thing is, because children are often looked down upon, when they are sick, hungry, or have an accident, they are easily abandoned. A small life lost is like a broken item thrown away. In a society that worships power, no one stops to mourn the loss of a small life. Looking back at history, we realize, no matter how brilliant a civilization is, if it is built on stolen childhoods, its glory is also tinged with tragedy. Rome may have cobbled streets and magnificent buildings, but under each stone, there may be the buried cry of a slave child. Today, when we think of children, we think of innocence, hope for the future. But in Rome, child slaves were a mirror of cruelty. Instead of being protected, they were sold. Instead of being loved, they were exploited. And that is one of the most painful wounds left by history. In the echoes of time, we can still hear the sound of small footsteps running on the cold stone floor, the panting of a child who has been served all day. Those echoes do not disappear. They remind us that freedom and childhood are two of the most sacred gifts. And once taken away, the wound will forever remain in human memory. Friends, slavery was not just about hard work. It was a curse that took away a person's most valuable things: freedom, dignity, childhood, and even life itself. How much do you know about slavery? Write in the comments. Do you find these stories interesting? Subscribe to the channel and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye. Rome was built on violence and blood. Slaves captured in wars, brought to the city and sold in the market. Everything seemed normal in that society. The question is, can we really separate the two aspects of Rome? You cannot understand the rise of Rome if you ignore the slave trade. Slavery was so deeply rooted in Rome that it affected almost every aspect of the city's life. Rome was built by slaves. The Forum, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, all built by the hands of slaves. Rome was also maintained by slaves. The farms, the shops, the houses, everything needed someone to serve, and slaves provided that workforce. The question is, where did these slaves come from? The answer is simple and brutal: war. Prisoners of war. Imagine a Roman soldier returning home after a long campaign. He is a hero, celebrated in triumph, greeted by his family and friends, adorned with laurel wreaths, and he carries with him not only the memory of battles, but also chains, shackles, a cage made of iron. That prisoner doesn't know Latin, doesn't understand Roman customs, but knows fear and pain very well. Those memories are imprinted in their minds, as are the chains on their wrists. That person who knew how to read and write, speak and pray, now speaks only the language of survival. His story is not unique. There are thousands of others like him, all captured, all imprisoned. They don't want anything more than freedom, even if it's hard to breathe. Every step must be justified, every word weighed, every gesture submitted, not daring to hope for anything, including a smile. The chain is heavy, but it's not visible. What the conqueror sees is booty, loot, riches, and slaves. To take captives was to ensure wealth. As spoils of war, they could be divided among soldiers or sold in the marketplace, Some slaves could work the fields, while others, more valuable due to their skills, were employed in households. Their work would pay for their food and clothing, and whatever was left over went to their owner's pocket. War was the bread and butter of slavery. Each legion that returned home brought new slaves. Families that received these captives saw themselves enriched. With heads of household freed from household chores, fathers and husbands could focus on politics or business. Wars created this prosperity, but they also caused crises during periods of peace. The slave market was saturated, creating a surplus of slaves. Prices plummeted, and with them, the value of human life. We may say it was just a matter of supply and demand, but we'd be forgetting about the brutality behind that equation. Slaves were not goods, they were humans. This situation led to competition. To attract customers, vendors used all kinds of tricks. One would offer a discount, another would throw in a bonus slave, a third would promise good health or strong muscles. It didn't matter if they were old or sick, they would throw anyone into the mix. It was a bizarre auction of human flesh. This devaluation had consequences. Slaves, deprived of their dignity, rebelled. They fled, hid, resisted. Groups of slaves plotting rebellion were common, and when desperation led them to action, Rome trembled before them. They fought against their oppressors, trying to win back their freedom, or at least some respect. Their stories are those of sadness, suffering, and struggle, but also of resistance, courage, and brotherhood. Rome's solution to these rebellions was brutal, swift, and efficient. No quarter was given. Leaders were crucified, bodies exhibited, and fear became the main tool of control. Rebellion was punished harshly. It was easier to keep buying and selling slaves than to allow them to rise up. Over time, the cruelty became naturalized. The Roman institution of slavery was so ingrained that questioning it seemed madness. Slavery was part of Roman society. It was considered necessary for the smooth running of the city. Slave revolts were seen as an attack on Rome itself, and every revolt brutally suppressed consolidated the idea that slavery was destiny. If you were born a slave, your fate was sealed. But if you were born a Roman, you could be a master. The entire system was based on inequality, but it functioned. Now we look back and shudder at the slave auctions, the cages and shackles, but at the time, it was considered normal. In fact, it was considered a sign of greatness. War brings many consequences, and in ancient Rome, the most painful ones came after the weapons fell silent. It was in peacetime that the wounds reopened. It was in peacetime that the true cost of war was felt. So the next time you hear someone talk about glorious conquests, remember the faces in the slave market. Remember the strength of those enslaved. Remember their fight for freedom. Remember that behind every brick of Rome, there's a story that history often forgets. Remember, war turns people into commodities, and if we allow ourselves to forget that, we'll be closer to repeating it. Part 105: Factors that determine the value of a slave. In the Roman slave market, the value of a human being was no longer measured by his or her character or soul, but by cold measures criteria that seemed to be valuing an item. If we stop in the middle of the square and look at the titular hanging on the chests of slaves, we will see a painful truth. There are 5 factors that determine the value of a living being. 1. Age. Youth converted into money. A young slave, in his 20s, healthy, always fetched a higher price. Youth meant years of labor ahead, meaning long-term profits. The old, with gray hair, were marked down to a pitiful price, often sold for next to nothing. In that harsh view, age was no longer a journey of experience, but merely an index of the level of wear and tear. 2. Health. The body is a tool. Buyers massaged muscles, examined teeth, and observed gait. A strong body meant the ability to do heavy work and prolonged working life. Conversely, a sick, limping, or emaciated person was immediately considered a defective product. They could be sold off or even abandoned. Humans, born with bodies to live, to love, to feel, were reduced to machines that produced strength. 3. Appearance. Beauty is commercialized, as we have seen. Appearance is what can skyrocket the price of a slave. A bright face, a well-proportioned figure, sparkling eyes all become commodities. Many beautiful slaves are bought not for labor, but as living ornaments. It is a tragedy when beauty, which should be a gift from nature, turns into chains that imprison a person for life. For skills, talents become tools. Those who knew how to read, write, or do mathematics, medicine, or music, or any other craft, were much more valuable. The Greeks, because of their tradition of learning, were often valued many times more. A Greek tutor could cost as much as a whole mansion. But such talent did not bring freedom. It only tightened the chains, for the master would never want to let go of his living treasure. 5. Origin. Origin determines destiny. The Romans believed that some people were born to work, others to do intellectual work. Slaves from Gaul or Thrace, strong and healthy, were often bought to serve as guards or do manual labor. Greeks, with their knowledge, were often turned into tutors or secretaries. Origin, once a source of pride, became a label on a commodity. In that bustling market, these 5 elements became the standard board for evaluating people. Buyers walked along the sales platforms, touching, looking, listening, Just like people choosing a horse, an ornament, or a vase, they bargained, argued, raised prices, lowered prices, while on the platforms, trembling people could only bow their heads. If we stand in the middle of that scene, we might see a heartbreaking paradox. Human beings, born with souls, with memories, with dreams, are reduced to 5 cold indices. A child is undervalued because he is still weak. A healthy young man is overvalued because he has many years of labor. A beautiful girl is worth several times more, but at the same time has to endure a lifetime of imprisonment. An old man who once had so many experiences, so many stories, is now just an expired commodity. The so-called value of a slave is essentially a value in the eyes of the buyer. It does not reflect who the person really is, but only the extent to which they can serve the interests of others. And when those interests disappear, their value also vanishes like dust. What is most disturbing is the normalization of cruelty. For the Romans, judging a person by these 5 criteria was natural. No one felt the need to question it. No one felt it was unfair. Just as we judge cattle, they judged their fellow man. And it is this indifference that is the deepest wound in history. However, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the sighs of those who were hung with price tags in the past. They did not have the chance to speak, but their eyes spoke for them. I am not a number. I am not a commodity. I am a human being. Greetings, everyone. Let's take a break from the Colosseum and Forum today. We will go to the place where even the greatest Roman emperor had to listen to complaints, the imperial kitchen. Yes, that's right. Today I want to talk about food again. However, we will not talk about feasts, delicacies, or exquisite wines. I invite you to watch our video about Caligula's feast. We will talk about the cuisine of the other side of the empire, the enslaved people, because they were the ones who prepared those sumptuous meals and delicacies. You could say that the story of slavery has been told over and over again, and you would be right. But every time we look at it from a different angle, we discover something new. So let us hear the story of female slaves who worked as cooks in Roman houses, while male slaves were often pushed out into the fields, construction sites, or the arenas. Female slaves shouldered a different burden, silent, harsh, and sometimes even more tragic. Their fate was like a small lamp placed in a dark kitchen, serving, enduring, and keeping themselves in silence. In every Roman home, female slaves were everywhere. Water carriers, fire makers, weavers, and baby rockers. From early morning, when the rooster crowed, they began their work, pounding flour, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. All this work, endless, like a monotonous song repeated day after day. The Romans had a saying, "A good slave girl is one who never lets anyone know she exists." That is the tragedy. Living in a house but not being counted as a person in that house. They are like shadows, serving every need, but never being addressed with respect. However, cooking is only one part of the identity. The other, more cruel part, is the abuse. A young female slave, with some beauty, can hardly avoid the lustful eyes of her master or the son in the family. They can be turned into concubinae, nameless, unmarried concubines, just tools for satisfaction. The bitter thing is that Roman law did not protect them at all. A master had full authority over the slave's body. That woman, despite feeling pain and fear, did not have the right to say no. In the eyes of society, this was not a crime, but only legal ownership. A body, a soul, was considered property, to be used as an object. There are children born of such relationships called verni who become slaves from birth. The mother, already without freedom, sees her own child in the same chains as herself. It is a vicious cycle of slavery, where one life of suffering follows another, with no way out. In addition, female slaves were sold into even darker places. Brothels, where their bodies were bought and sold, without any dignity left. There, it was no longer about serving in the kitchen, but about the public destruction of human dignity. A woman who could have been a mother, a wife, a keeper of the family fire, was forced to become a commodity in the eyes of strange men. What pains me most is the calmness of society. The Romans did not see this as unjust. They saw it as normal, as a natural part of life. It was this silence that protected so many tears from being shed in the dark. But in that silence, female slaves still have moments of being human. When they sing a lullaby to a child, they may remember their own child. When they weave, they may convey in each stitch a longing for their distant homeland. When they cook a meal, they may secretly dream of a home they have lost. It is these small fragments that keep them a little bit human, a little bit of hope, in the midst of the storm of cruelty. There were kind of masters who allowed female slaves to be close to them, to be treated as family. But that was the exception. And even when they were loved, that love was still based on ownership. A relationship built on chains, no matter how gentle, could not hide the fact that the woman did not belong to him. Looking back at history, we realize that the status of female slaves is a mirror reflecting the fragility of human life. They were mothers, servants, and exploited. They kept the fire in the kitchen and were burned in the darkness. Perhaps in the long nights of Rome, there were female slaves sitting silently by the charcoal stove, their eyes gazing into the distance. They did not speak, but their hearts were pounding. I am also human. I also know how to love, how to hurt, how to dream. Unfortunately, that voice was swallowed by time, buried in the silence of a society that worships power. And that is why when we think of Rome, we not only think of the monuments and the arenas, but also of the silent figures in the kitchens and dark rooms of women who carried on their shoulders the double chains of slavery and of gender. Friends, I hope we managed to show you that ancient Rome was not only about wars and conquests, but also about the lives of ordinary people. Join us next week and find out what the most popular dishes of in the vast realm of ancient Rome, where power and opulence reigned supreme, there existed a class of individuals who played a significant, yet often overlooked role in society. They were the eunuchs, men whose lives were forever altered by a traumatic procedure, leaving them physically incomplete and emotionally scarred. Welcome back to our channel, where today we delve into the harrowing tales of the eunuchs in Roman history. These men, once ordinary citizens, were subjected to a brutal practice that stripped them of their manhood and reduced them to mere tools of convenience for the ruling elite. We will explore the dark origins of this disturbing practice and its lasting impact on the lives of these unfortunate souls. Eunuchs were men who had been castrated, a horrifying process that removed their testicles and rendered them infertile. This procedure was not performed for medical reasons, but rather as a means to enhance their perceived value in society. The Romans believed that by removing the source of sexual desire, they could ensure unwavering loyalty and obedience. And while it may seem barbaric, this belief was deeply ingrained in their culture and went largely unquestioned. The demand for eunuchs grew steadily in Roman society, leading to a disturbing trade that thrived across the empire. They were highly sought after as servants for wealthy families and influential individuals who desired complete control over their domestic staff. A eunuch's inability to procreate also made him valuable in maintaining the purity of noble bloodlines, a concept that held immense importance in Roman culture. The process of castration itself was a brutal and agonizing experience. It was typically performed on young boys, sometimes as young as 4 years old, and carried out without anesthesia. The removal of their testicles was not only physically excruciating but also left them psychologically traumatized. Many eunuchs suffered lifelong health issues and disabilities as a result of this horrific ordeal. Despite their diminished physical and emotional state, eunuchs were often treated as prized possessions. Wealthy Romans would flaunt their eunuchs as symbols of their power and influence, showcasing them as trophies of their wealth and dominance. This perverse display of wealth and power only added to the indignity and humiliation experienced by the eunuchs. As we further explore the lives of these forgotten individuals, we will uncover the hidden costs of their servitude. Eunuchs were not merely silent observers within the households they served. They were active participants in the daily lives of their masters, often holding positions of trust and responsibility. Despite their compromised physical abilities, they excelled in various roles, including serving as secretaries, accountants, and even advisors. Their knowledge of literature, history, and philosophy was highly valued, as well as their ability to provide companionship and engage in intellectual discussions. However, their presence in influential circles did little to alleviate the prejudice and discrimination they faced. Eunuchs were often viewed with suspicion and disdain by Roman society. They were denied basic rights and were subjected to derogatory language and harmful stereotypes. Their lack of masculinity was mocked, and they were seen as lesser human beings, unfit for full citizenship. Furthermore, the very nature of their service left them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. In an era where consent meant little and power dynamics were heavily skewed, eunuchs were at the mercy of their employers. Many endured harsh punishments for perceived insubordination or mistakes, ranging from beatings to imprisonment. Some were even put to death for alleged crimes that may or may not have been real. The story of the eunuchs serves as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the enduring legacy of trauma. Their silenced voices deserve to be heard, and their stories must be told to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. By shedding light on their experiences, we honor the memory of those who suffered and pay tribute to their resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. If you find these stories intriguing and informative, please don't forget to stay tuned for more historical insights. Thank you for watching. Are you ready to dive again into the abyss of history? Let's get started. Part 13. Open or secret. Two forms of buying and selling in the bustling streets of the Roman Empire. Slave markets were everywhere. The buying and selling of human beings went on as regularly as breathing. It seemed as natural as trading grain or cattle. But that exchange didn't just happen out in the open in the marketplace. It also took place in hidden corners, in dim oil lamp-lit rooms where shady merchants dealt in the darkest of commodities, human lives. These were two worlds, both centered on the same cruel reality, the buying and selling of human beings. One was open, shameless, and brazen. The other was hidden, shrouded in secrecy and silence. Let's first explore the world that was on display, the slave markets and the public squares. Imagine yourself in the heart of ancient Rome, standing amidst the towering Forum Romanum with its endless bustle. All around you, merchants hawk their wares, lawyers argue their cases, and politicians vie for attention. Amidst this clamor, you suddenly notice a commotion around a high wooden platform. As you push your way through the crowd, you see men, women, and children standing with numbers tied around their necks like lifeless puppets. They stand there silently, waiting to be inspected, examined, and finally sold. Some are old and emaciated, their bodies bearing the marks of a life of toil. Others are young and strong, their faces etched with anxiety and fear. You watch as a merchant paces before them, gesturing towards each one with a flick of his finger. He points to their numbers, calling out details that are supposed to entice potential buyers. Age, health, profession, strength, and even weaknesses are announced in a monotonous drone. This is a spectacle that is supposed to be normal, ordinary, commonplace. Here in the open square, under the bright sunlight, everything is laid bare. Slaves are nothing more than commodities, objects to be bought and sold like any other product. Their humanity, their hopes and dreams, all reduced to a mere footnote in a transaction. The Romans saw nothing wrong with this. In their eyes, a slave was merely an object, a tool to be used for profit. And so the buying and selling continued unabated in the bustling marketplaces of Rome. The sound of the auctioneer's hammer echoed in the open squares, each stroke signifying the changing of ownership, the stripping away of another human soul. Now let's move to the shadowy underbelly of this trade, the secret deals struck in the dead of night. Picture this. You're in a dimly lit room in a distant corner of the city. The air is thick with the stench of stale waste and unwashed bodies. You try to make out faces in the flickering torchlight and see merchants huddled around, their eyes gleaming with avarice. On the floor before them lies a pile of goods, not precious metals or fine fabrics, but human beings. Here in the dark, the rules of the open market no longer apply. These are special sales. Discretion is key and the dealings are far more sinister. Children are bought and sold, their innocence and helplessness exploited. Beautiful women are traded as sexual commodities, their worth measured by their beauty and youth. Those purchased for nefarious purposes are brought here, their dignity stripped away behind closed doors. Here in the darkness, the full extent of human depravity is revealed. There are no watchful eyes, no constraints of morality. It's just the exchange of money and the surrender of human souls. Two sides of the same coin. These two worlds may seem vastly different, the open market square and the covert underground chamber. But in essence, they are two sides of the same coin. Both are engaged in the buying and selling of human beings, reducing individuals to mere commodities. In the one case, it is done openly with brazen disregard for human rights. In the other, it is concealed in the shadows, hidden from the prying eyes of the public, whether conducted in the harsh glare of daylight or the dim glow of oil lamps. The end result is always the same, the commodification of human beings. Perhaps if we listen very carefully, we can still hear the echoes of these transactions. From the marketplace, we can almost hear the hollow sound of voices being auctioned off, the despairing cries of families torn apart. From the underground chambers, we can sense the hushed whispers, the heavy footsteps, and the clink of coins exchanged for human lives. These sounds, so different and yet so similar, blend together to create a haunting symphony of human suffering. Today, as we look back at this dark chapter in history, we can't help but shudder at the thought. Regardless of whether the trade in human beings takes place out in the open or behind closed doors, it remains a grim reminder of the depths of human cruelty. It compels us to remember that the worst atrocities can be committed in broad daylight or hidden in the darkest corners of society. Rome is a glorious ancient civilization, isn't it? Their roads, aqueducts, law, and even the way they managed crowds are things we still admire today. But behind that greatness, we often forget there's another story. A story of wars, conquests, and the cruel reality of their day. You know, the Roman Empire built its wealth on slavery. To them, slaves weren't just a means of labor, they were a symbol of status. And we're not talking about ordinary labor here. We're talking about an entire civilization that has elevated subjugating people to an art form. Wow. In this episode, we'll explore the dark side of Roman life. You know, the things they did in the name of fashion and style. Let's start with a question. What was the first thing you think of when you hear about Roman parties? Was it wine, poetry, or maybe candlelight? Well, actually, it was the slaves. In the eyes of the Romans, a party wasn't just about good food or drink. It was also about having a lot of servants to show off. The more slaves you had, the fancier your place looked. The real entertainment wasn't in the games, but in the display of power. Imagine this. You're at a party, sipping your wine and admiring the view. There's the famous actor Aeneas, dressed in the finest clothes, holding a golden plate and dancing just for me. Or how about the enchanting Greek singer singing songs of love and war? Their voices are so beautiful, aren't they? In reality, these people are just slaves, bought and sold for profit. And those who can't bear this humiliation escape through death. However, their deaths don't evoke any sympathy from the Romans. Instead, it becomes a new topic of conversation at parties, a testament to their own superiority. But why just slaves? What about prisoners of war? Did they have any better fate? Sadly, no. In the eyes of the Romans, a captive was simply a trophy, a sign that they were stronger. And don't think that being a prisoner of war meant you'd always be treated badly. Your fate depended on the whims of your conqueror. Some captives could end up as slaves, while others would walk free after paying a ransom. The choice, however, was entirely up to the Roman commander. In their eyes, a captive was nothing more than a bargaining chip. Even women and children weren't spared. Rome wasn't exactly known for being a champion of human rights, right? And let's talk about something the Romans really took pride in: their gladiators. These warriors didn't just fight for the audience's amusement, they were also a symbol of Rome's strength. Capturing a gladiator wasn't just a victory on the battlefield, it was also a chance to show off, of course. Most gladiators died horribly, but their deaths were seen as a testament to Rome's greatness. Every battle was a spectacle, a display of power for the whole world to see. In the vast Roman Empire, not all governors behaved impeccably. While some ruled with wisdom, others indulged in excesses, and the unfortunate locals sometimes paid the price. How many of you have heard of the terrible deeds of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate? He is infamous for his brutality and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In his eyes, subjecting people was nothing more than a means of maintaining control. The more humiliated and subdued the population, the greater his sense of authority, you see. For the Romans, subjugating people was more than just a means of governance. It was a way of life. They believed that strength and obedience were virtues, and showing off one's power was a sign of wealth and culture. So what do you think? Does the history of the Romans make you rethink your perception of their grandeur? How else do you think they can flaunt their wealth and power? Do share your thoughts in the comments section below. In addition to expanding its territory, the Roman Empire also expanded its infamous list of insults, conquering new lands. It also captured new ways to mock and humiliate people. Apparently, being a slave wasn't the worst fate in ancient Rome. You could also be a freed slave, and that was truly humiliating. Now enslaved people couldn't complain because even if they won their freedom, they wouldn't be fully respected. Society saw them as half slaves, half free, which was worse than being a regular slave. Why? Because they were constantly reminded of their past. Freed people couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court, and had to save money for their former masters. Plus, their children and grandchildren remained enslaved for 2 more generations. So being freed was like a drop of water in the desert, a little mercy from the master, nothing more. Do you know who made up the majority of Rome's slaves? Prisoners of war, mostly from Greece, Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. Once captured, they were branded with hot iron, losing their old identity forever. From now on, they belonged to Rome. Male or female, young or old, everyone was put to work. Slaves built roads, farmed, cleaned toilets, or served at banquets. Their work was endless, and their rights were non-existent. If a slave tried to escape, they would be severely punished. And if they were caught plotting a rebellion, they were usually crucified. Well folks, that's about it for today's episode. What do you think about the dark side of Roman life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you want to support us, please hit that thumbs up button and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time. This is our story. This is the story of ancient Rome, and you are watching part 15 and the final part of the series. We do not know where you are in your journey through the Roman world, so we encourage you to start from the beginning. Follow along to see what life was like in those distant times. Every slap echoed with hatred, every kick with contempt. What could little Titus Aurelius Fulvus do? At the ripe age of 12, he had already heard his name called countless times at the Gladiator Academy. He had felt the sting of whips on his back and the burning pain of training swords piercing his skin. Was this his destiny? Would he forever be known as a gladiator? One evening after a grueling training session, Titus stumbled out of the academy, his body aching, his spirit broken. He sat down on a nearby stone bench, letting the cool marble soothe his hot cheeks. Suddenly, a man's voice cut through the evening air. Do you believe you are destined to be just another cog in the emperor's entertainment machine? Titus looked up to see a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a face lined with wisdom. Who are you? My name is Lucius Cornelius Mirianus, the man replied with a smile, and I am here to offer you a chance to change your fate. Lucius explained that he was an influential senator who was interested in expanding his library with rare manuscripts and scrolls. I hear you possess knowledge about Roman history and literature. Are these skills of any use to me? Titus nodded, surprised by the question. But I am just a gladiator, not a scholar. Lucius smiled again. That does not matter. Your experiences and observations are valuable. I want to hear your stories, your views on Rome, on life itself. Will you help me collect these thoughts and experiences in written form? Thus began an unusual mentorship. Lucius provided Titus with books, scrolls, and quills, while Titus shared his unique perspective on Roman life, gleaned from years of training, observation, and personal experience. Together they explored themes such as justice, honor, bravery, and betrayal, all subjects close to the heart of a gladiator. One evening, as they discussed the issue of slavery in Rome, Titus asked a question that had been burning in his mind. Why did you choose me? Why help a lowly gladiator like me? Lucius looked him in the eye. because in you, I see the soul of Rome, the hopes, the pains, the struggles. Your story is not just yours, it belongs to every Roman. By helping you, I am helping a piece of Rome itself. As months passed, Lucius noticed a transformation in Titus. His body, once wiry and tense, now bore the marks of maturity. His eyes, once filled with despair, now shone with determination. One day Titus approached Lucius with a stack of scrolls. "Here is my story, my view of Rome," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Lucius took the scrolls, his heart swelling with pride. "You have done well, Titus. Now go forth and show Rome that a gladiator's mind can be as sharp as his sword." Encouraged by Lucius's words, Titus decided to take a step beyond his mentor's expectations. He used the skills he had developed during his training to begin gladiatorial combat training with other young men. In secret, his sessions were not sanctioned by the emperor and were held in hidden corners of the city. But the news of these secret meetings soon reached the ears of Emperor Domitian. The emperor summoned both Titus and Lucius to his palace. "So you have been teaching young men to fight in secret," Domitian said, his voice echoing with power. "Is this how you repay the empire's generosity? By plotting rebellion?" "Your Majesty, I was merely sharing my skills." Titus began to defend himself, but Domitian raised his hand. "Enough. Do not insult the empire's power with your lies. You have chosen your fate, and now you will face the consequences." Titus was stripped of his freedom and sentenced to the mines, while Lucius, accused of abetting a gladiators' rebellion, was banished from Rome. Despite their unjust fates, both men knew their efforts had not been in vain. Others would continue their work, carrying forward the torch of forbidden education. In the lonely silence of the mines, Titus Aurelius Fulvus continued to educate himself and the miners. His teachings, a beacon of hope in the darkness of captivity. Meanwhile, Lucius Cornelius Marianus returned to Athens, re-establishing his academy and continuing his philosophical studies. Although their paths diverged, both men remained steadfast in their commitment to education, determined to ensure that knowledge and enlightenment would prevail. News of Titus's influence among the miners eventually reached the ears of the emperor's son, Titus Flavius Sabinus. Intrigued, Titus Flavius secretly visited the mines. Impressed by what he saw, he reported back to his father, urging a change in policy towards the miners. However, Domitian, consumed by paranoia and distrust, only tightened his grip on the mines. Years passed, Domitian's reign came to an end, and the next generation of Roman leadership took over. Under the new regime, conditions in the mines improved. Prisoners were treated better, and many, including Titus, were granted amnesty and allowed to return to the city. Back in Rome, Titus found the city transformed. The Forum was bustling with activity, the Colosseum echoed with cheers, and the streets teemed with merchants and citizens. He realized that Rome had changed, and so had he. His experiences in the mines had tempered him, sharpening his intellect and determination. No longer content to be a simple former gladiator, Titus set his sights on political life. He joined a political party, the Populares, led by Lucius Licinius Crassus, who championed the rights of the common people. Through his association with the Populares, Titus became acquainted with Gaius Mucius Scaevola, a leading figure in the Roman Senate. Recognizing Titus's intelligence and eloquence, Scaevola took him under his wing, guiding him in the ways of Roman law and governance. Meanwhile, news of Domitian's brutality spread throughout the empire, tarnishing Rome's reputation. Titus, now a respected member of Roman society, used his unique experiences to defend Rome against outside critics. He argued that although Domitian's actions were regrettable, they did not represent the true character of Rome or its people. As the years went by, Titus's political career flourished. He rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a consul. During his tenure, he introduced reforms aimed at improving the lives of the common people, drawing upon his own past struggles to inform his policies. His fellow senators, initially skeptical of the former gladiator, came to respect and admire him. One evening, as Titus surveyed the bustling forum, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. He remembered his early days in Rome, his despair, his hunger, his thirst for a better life. Looking at the faces around him, he saw not just Romans but fellow human beings, each with a story, a struggle, and a dream. In the twilight of his life, Titus Aurelius Fulvus, the former gladiator, looked back on a life that defied the odds. He had gone from the depths of despair to the heights of Roman society, all without compromising his principles or forgetting his roots. His story was a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and perseverance can lead to extraordinary heights. So ends our tale, the tale of ancient Rome. We hope you enjoyed this journey through time, this exploration of a civilization that shaped our world. Along the way, we've met emperors and gladiators, senators and slaves, and together we've witnessed the triumphs and tragedies of a bygone era. What emotions did this story evoke in you? What images still linger in your mind's eye? And what lessons from this ancient world do you think apply to our own today? Share your thoughts with us. And remember, the story of Rome is not just a tale of the past, it's a reflection of humanity, a mirror to our own times. and perhaps within its pages, we can find insights to help us navigate the challenges of our own era. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay curious, keep exploring, and above all, keep believing in the power of stories to shape our understanding of the past and our place in it. Until next time, let the spirit of Rome's enduring legacy inspire you to reach for the stars.